Hampton Court, on the edge of London. Once the pleasure palace of Henry VIII, today it attracts almost 1 million tourists a year.
That's the number one question. Where's the Royal Loo?
It's one of Britain's biggest palaces, with 750 acres of remarkable grounds.
You have to imagine Hampton Court as a deep dish lasagna, built up of layers of history.
Amazing spaces and staff.
Everything about this room says the power of the Tudors.
Stuffed with history.
Various officers were based here. One of them was a chap called Winston Churchill.
And incredible discoveries.
This is a moment I'm going to remember for the rest of my life.
A palace packed with historic secrets, still full of life today.
Mr. Darcy, eh?
In this episode, we reveal the deadly rivalry between Henry VIII's daughters.
When Elizabeth enters the room, it's obvious that Mary feels that she holds all the cards.
George the Shire horse foal trains for a job.
He very much is sort of a teenage sort of character, thinks he knows everything but doesn't.
And the palace prepares a huge memorial for the soldiers of World War I.
You may have thought, will I see home again? Will I see my family again?
It's November, and despite the chilly weather, visitors are still making the most of Hampton Court's breathtaking grounds, soaking up the history, and of course the palace's 60 acres of formal gardens. Constructed by King William and Queen Mary in the late 1600s, the East Front Garden is known for its ornamental yew trees, regal fountain, and immaculate lawn. And it's about to become famous for something else.
Well, it's a lovely day.
I know, right? We've lucked out.
The palace is gearing up for one of its most important dates in the calendar, Remembrance Day. It's held on the 11th of November each year, the date the armistice was signed to end hostilities in the First World War. A tradition was then created by King George V in 1919 to commemorate the soldiers who died in battle. It's been a time to remember those lost in the line of duty ever since. This year, Interpretation Officer Zakira Begum is in charge of organising the biggest Remembrance Day memorial
Do you want me to be a marker?
Hampton Court has ever seen.
Today we're going to be installing the new installation called Standing with Giants, which will tell the story of Hampton Court and its connection to World War I.
So, Zakira, if we imagine then that this flower bed and
Yes.
the gates at the back
Yeah.
was the line.
She's working with the charity Standing with Giants to put the special commemoration together.
I'm just trying to work this out with the statue.
Can't move the
I know,
statue,
of course you
sorry.
can't, I'm joking with you. OK, let's have a think.
Dan Barton is its founder.
I put an installation on a hill above the M40 motorway a few years ago, just thinking people would see it from the motorway, and astonishingly 10,000 people pitched up.
Dan's first installation in Oxfordshire back in 2019 saw the silhouettes of 100 World War I soldiers, or Tommies, as they became known, standing in a field of poppies. The response from the public was amazing.
I realised then that this was meant to be, and I could take this project an awful lot further.
Hampton Court's military links go back to 1689, when barracks were built on site. They're the oldest in the UK, and were used by the British Army until the 1900s.
So what we'll do first is we'll lay the silhouettes out over the whole area.
During the First World War, many staff and residents enlisted to fight, including the gardeners, who would have worked in the palace grounds. 5 were lost in action. So when Dan approached the palace about putting in the installation, it seemed a fitting tribute. The memorial consists of 125 individually crafted metal silhouettes, all of which need to be arranged on the lawn.
We've got 50 per side. I'm going to work on the parameters at the front now. So that's the far side, and this is this side.
But getting them into the perfect position is no easy task.
Bob, they're left and right, my friend. So one on your left, Bob. The one on your left.
That one on the left. Just drop that one.
All right.
Yeah.
Each soldier must be carefully positioned to create the display, which covers 2,500 square meters in total. This installation will also feature something that's never been seen before. As well as the Tommy soldiers, Zakira has commissioned another silhouette to stand next to them.
So you'll notice we have Indian soldiers being installed alongside the traditional Tommy soldier for this installation.
More than 1 million Indian soldiers volunteered to serve in World War I as part of the British India Army, with the first regiments dispatched to France just weeks after war was declared. They would go on to fight in some of the bloodiest battles seen on the Western Front. Once the war had ended, in the summer of 1919, Hampton Court played host to 1,800 Indian soldiers who travelled from all over the world to be part of the peace celebrations.
We've chosen to represent the Sikh soldiers because they actually camped just across from us here where we're installing. It's a story that we know about, but we've never really focused on here. So we'll be talking about what they got up to when they were here, what was camp life like, and also did they go anywhere else in London.
400 years before the Indian troops arrived here, Hampton Court was a sprawling Tudor country retreat where royalty came to relax.
Hampton Court had always been used as like a holiday home, a party palace.
It was splendid enough to host monarchs from across Europe. Even today, it's surrounded by 750 acres of parkland. To take care of the grounds, the palace employs a team of rare breed Shire horses.
Right, go on then, lad.
Head coachman, Ed McDowell, oversees the herd of 12 shires.
Well, the Shire horses are definitely part of the Hampton Court history.
They're housed in stables a mile from the palace. Shire horses were once a common sight, ploughing the fields in Britain. Now, sadly, they are an endangered breed. Hampton Court Palace is determined to ensure their survival.
Whenever we've got a job that we can use horses for, we try and use them.
Only around 300 Shire foals are born in Britain each year.
Easy boy. I know.
But the palace is lucky. They've got 2 youngsters.
This is George, first Shire to be born up here in over 100 years. And we're just giving him a quick groom.
Stable groom Lizzie White has been looking after George since he was born in 2020.
He's still a youngster, so sometimes he's a bit goofy with his back legs. That's just him getting used to things.
As part of the only herd of working shires in London, it's crucial that young George is trained properly so he can continue the tradition of working the land.
Over you go.
But first, he's got a bit of growing up to do.
He's not quite ready for work yet, but we are slowly starting to introduce him to different things. He very much is sort of a teenage sort of character, thinks he knows everything, but doesn't.
Being social animals, horses are happiest when they have company. So when George was born, Ed moved another foal named Louis next door.
These two are inseparable. They really get on really well together. Louis is quiet, very quiet little horse, whereas George is a big boisterous thing. But George looks after him, you know, and is quite protective of him.
Louis may be quiet, but he's on track to be a gentle giant.
They usually grow one end at a time. His bum's come up. Now next year, hopefully his withers will come up. And then his bum will come up, and that's how it goes until they even out.
When they're fully grown, George and Louis will be expected to pull their weight around the palace. So Ed has them on a training regime.
George is ready to have his harness put on him. You don't want them to associate fear with putting on the harness. So you have to do everything at a pace that doesn't, you know, scare them, doesn't alarm them, really. So that's what we're going to try and do today.
If George is to ever drive a cart or pull farm equipment,
Hi, Georgie.
learning to wear the harness is a crucial step.
So what we're going to do now is put some straps and bits and bobs on him, just to get him used to having the feel of the weight of him.
Today is one of the first times George has worn the harness, and no one knows how he'll react. So Lizzie must tread extremely carefully. The sensation of the leather on his skin will be brand new.
He's a good boy. There's a good boy. Well, he's definitely not frightened of us, that's for sure. It's a lovely feeling when you build their trust. Come on, fella.
George seems to have taken the new harness in his stride. So far, anyway.
There's a good boy. It's always a relief when it goes well, you know. So the next step now will be to get his collar on him. But not today.
Coming up, the World War I Memorial discovers the challenges of working with an historic site.
I need to mark the drill so we don't damage any underground history.
There's a battle to preserve a priceless treasure from pests.
If there were going to be any insect activity, it might be lurking at the edges.
And Henry VIII's paranoia goes into overdrive.
He wanted you to know that everything that happened here was by the king's command.
It's mid-morning at Hampton Court Palace.
We have maps on the table.
Hundreds of visitors are already out in the historic gardens and parkland. Out on the east front lawn, an extraordinary display is being installed to mark Remembrance Day. But with the actual day just around the corner, the deadline is looming.
I am a bit nervous about this because we've had quite a tight turnaround time in terms of getting the installation off the ground and getting it ready to be installed for this month.
Hampton Court Palace is of such importance, there are strict controls about putting anything in the ground.
This is a historic site and we've been given a depth of 30 centimetres to drill to. So I need to mark the drills so that we don't drill below that point. So we don't damage any underground history. And that's one of the challenges with the site.
As well as representing the traditional Tommy soldiers, this year Hampton Court is honouring the Indian forces who served in World War I. Zakira Begum has been studying images of them to create the silhouettes.
We have photographic imagery of them being at this site. They could have been standing at this point, basically, right here, right now, and they could have marched into the palace just behind us.
Helping Zakira find out more about the Indian forces here is curator Misha Ewan. Today she's heading to Hampton Court's archive room, and she's uncovered something intriguing.
We have tons of rooms like this that contain the records of the palace's history, and what I have here are some examples relating to the Indian soldiers that were camped at the palace in 1919.
Shortly after the armistice, King George V, the Queen's grandfather, invited soldiers from across the British Empire to London to take part in a huge peace celebration marking the end of the war. It was a chance to thank them for their bravery and sacrifice.
They needed somewhere that was close to London, so Hampton Court obviously had a huge amount of space.
The peace celebrations marked the first time some of these troops had ever been to Britain.
From this postcard, which shows one soldier shaving another, you really get a sense of what daily life was like for the men in the camp, and you can see the different tents in the background.
An enormous number of Indian soldiers, almost 75,000 of them, died fighting for the British Empire, thousands of miles away from home. Their loss would have been felt.
When the soldiers were here in 1919, there was lots of celebration, and of course people were really happy that the war had ended, but it was also a way to commemorate the soldiers that had lost their lives during World War I. And I think there would have been really mixed emotions amongst the men that were camped here.
During their stay at Hampton Court, they were taken to the Zoo and the Tower of London.
So I think that this time that they would have spent in London would have been, a brief period to decompress and reflect on what they had experienced before many of them headed home to their own towns and villages in India.
Using these photos, Misha is able to work out where the encampment would have been over a century ago. It would have sat on what is now a golf course, just a few hundred meters from the palace.
So we know it was an absolutely massive camp. There were well over 1,000 Indian soldiers that were stationed here. And we know that the camp was made up of different sleeping facilities and cooking facilities. And the way that it was organised was to accommodate the different religious needs of the soldiers as well, because of course the Indian Army was incredibly diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic. So there were Muslim soldiers as well as Hindus and Sikhs and Gurkha soldiers too. I've got this wonderful photo here, and you can see that the soldiers would have been marching up just here where I'm standing now. And if you look, nothing has really changed. The scene looks exactly the same, except of course this is 1919. It's just a wonderful snippet of the history at the time, actually.
Inside the palace, the visitors get to enjoy magnificent spaces, which are a feast for the eyes.
And actually, it's very fitting that we are standing in the Tudor part of the palace. Not many people know this, but Henry and Anne Boleyn actually designed this part of the palace together.
Hampton Court contains an enormous collection of over 30,000 precious artifacts, from paintings to historic clothing. Taking care of them is a full-time job for a team of 22 people. Today, Preventative Conservation Manager Kerin Harris is cleaning some of the most valuable items in the whole palace, the tapestries. There are a total of 50 here, and together, staggeringly, these ancient textiles are second only in value to the crown jewels. It means Kerin must be on constant alert for every conservator's worst nightmare: moths.
We'll be looking at the edges of the tapestry, particularly because that's where, if there were going to be any insect activity, it might be lurking.
Aptly called the tapestry moth, an adult female can lay up to 200 eggs at a time. Once hatched, the larvae feast on natural fibres, and they can cause irreparable damage in a heartbeat. So Kerin's not taking any chances.
We'll have a close look of all of the different areas of the surface just to ensure that there's no pests lurking within the crevices.
Satisfied that there are no horrors hiding in the seams, the next job is to vacuum the surface carefully to prevent the build-up of dust. Dirt on the tapestries is not only a food source for pests, but can also harden like cement, damaging the fragile fibres and dulling their colour.
We use this fine mesh, which allows the dust to travel through it, but it creates a barrier between the tapestry and the vacuum head. Most tapestries are held up with Velcro. It allows for them to be salvaged quickly in an emergency.
It takes just over 3 hours for 3 people to clean this one tapestry, and there are still another 24 on display.
It's a full-time job for a group of people, and it's a real privilege for all of us to be able to do it.
Many of Hampton Court's tapestries were commissioned by Henry VIII in 1537 to celebrate the birth of his long-awaited son, Edward. They were a giant billboard advertising his virility and strength. For Tudor monarchs, power meant everything, and keeping their grip on it was the top priority. The threat of conspiracy and rebellion was never far away. Even in Henry's most public spaces like the Great Hall, subjects were never allowed to forget they were under surveillance.
Everything about this room could be intimidating. As you come up these stairs here and come through the doorway, you'll see lining this room yeoman guards. They're all about 6 foot or above, so they're very tall, strapping men.
But Henry took his security to the next level, with an extra detail that fascinates palace host Errol Clayton.
If you look up at the ceiling on the easements which hold the roof up, you'll see these little wooden faces looking down at you. These are the eavesdroppers. They're a reminder to everyone who visits Hampton Court that the king is always watching and he's always listening to you. And it could be where the phrase eavesdropping comes from. I think what they say about the king is that as he got older, he was probably quite a paranoid man, that he wants everyone to behave. He wanted you to know that everything that happened here was by the king's command.
Henry's paranoia ran in the family. When his Catholic daughter Mary Tudor came to the throne in 1553, she immediately faced a string of Protestant plots against her. Fearing for her safety and the crown, she crushed her opponents with brutal force. Amongst them was Sir Thomas Wyatt, who led a rebellion in protest against Mary's marriage to Catholic Philip II of Spain. And worse still, Mary's half-sister Princess Elizabeth was implicated in his plot. Historic Royal Palace's chief curator Tracy Borman is investigating a tale of bitter sibling rivalry.
The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth is really well documented. Even though their mothers had been deadly enemies, in fact, the two sisters were quite close in childhood, but all of that changed when Mary came to the throne.
Mary was a devout Catholic, like her mother, Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. But Elizabeth had been raised a Protestant.
She therefore became a natural figurehead for all the Protestant rebels who wanted to oust Mary from the throne. To make matters worse, Mary didn't have any children, so Elizabeth was next in line to the throne. All of this made Mary deeply suspicious of her sister, and that made Elizabeth very vulnerable indeed.
When Elizabeth was implicated in the Wyatt rebellion, Mary summoned her for interrogation.
Hearing that she was going to be brought in for questioning shocked Elizabeth so much that she suffered a complete mental collapse. And we have an account of this. The 3 cabinet members rudely entered the chamber at 10 o'clock at night. Her enfeebled state permitted her to be moved only by short stages in a journey of such length to London.
On the 16th of March 1554, Mary sent her council members to collect Elizabeth and take her by boat to the Tower. But Elizabeth wasn't ready to go without a fight. At the National Archives in Kew, Tracy has found extraordinary evidence of Elizabeth's desperate plan to avoid the Tower.
I am so excited to see this letter. It's not overstating it to say it's one of the most important documents in English history. So this is known as the Tide letter because Elizabeth's buying time here. She knows that the longer she takes to write it, the more chances there are that her captors are going to miss the tide. She won't be able to be taken to the Tower that day.
But Elizabeth's delaying tactics had another motive. She wanted to speak to her sister in person and privately.
The main point of the letter is here when Elizabeth begs Mary, "I humbly beseech your majesty to let me answer before yourself and not suffer me to trust your counsellors." Because what Elizabeth's saying is we need to talk directly with nobody else around because she can't trust anybody else. She knows that they're all speaking against her to Mary. And the extent of her paranoia is shown on the following page as well, because there's this large blank space at the end of the letter. Well, Elizabeth doesn't want to leave it blank. She's scored lines all the way across so that nobody can go and add something in that might incriminate her afterwards.
The letter tells us a huge amount about just how Elizabeth must have been feeling.
You can sense Elizabeth's terror as she writes this letter because she knows she's about to be taken to the Tower of London. That's where her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed. It has really bad associations for Elizabeth, and she knows that not many people come out alive. She thinks that she's going to be taken to her death.
Elizabeth's letter did buy her a little time. But the next day brought a new tide, and she was taken to the Tower as a prisoner. She languished there for 9 terrifying weeks before being placed under house arrest. Then, a year later, the young princess was suddenly moved to Hampton Court. Mary then sent a summons demanding Elizabeth visit her in person. But very worryingly, it came in the dead of night. Tracy picks up the story.
Even now, it's quite spooky in the palace at night, and it must have been even more so in Elizabeth's day, because this was an age where they relied entirely on natural light. So there would have been candles flickering, but it would have been much, much darker at night and more scary. Elizabeth was all too well aware that if they'd wanted to quietly get rid of her, then under cover of darkness at night, that would have been the ideal time. When Elizabeth enters the room, it's obvious that Mary feels that she holds all the cards. She thinks she's pregnant and she has her sister there exactly where she wants her. She proceeds to interrogate her, put her under intense pressure to confess that she was part of that rebellion against the Queen.
Once again, Elizabeth finds herself pleading for her life.
For all her terror, Elizabeth shows incredible courage. She refuses to admit any guilt, and she defends herself so eloquently that Mary has little choice but to back down.
Elizabeth was now in the clear, and her release seemed inevitable. Then fate stepped in to cement her position. News broke from Hampton Court that Mary had given birth to a healthy boy. There was great celebration. But the joy was short-lived. The report turned out to be false. There was no baby. In fact, there wasn't even a pregnancy. Mary would never go on to have a child.
It was a humiliating tragedy for Mary, but for Elizabeth, it must have been a huge relief. Elizabeth must have sensed that the throne was finally within her grasp.
Coming up, it's a big moment for the Remembrance Day team.
Quite emotional to actually look at it all finished together like this. I think it's very poignant.
Come back.
And there's a tricky task for William, the Shire horse.
I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know how he's going to behave with it. Come on, steady, easy. Whoa.
It's lunchtime at the palace. And whilst nowadays that means a quick pit stop in the cafe, 500 years ago, it was a much more impressive affair.
Welcome to the Great Hall, the heart of Hampton Court. It has been here since the beginning.
This extraordinary building was constructed by Henry VIII to be the perfect setting for royal audiences and for epic entertaining. In Henry's time, it would have been alive with activity.
This room, it's the largest room in Hampton Court. You'll have 600 meals being served here twice daily. So this room will be a massive activity. There'll be people eating, there'll be noise. It will be really quite busy.
The Tudor palace would have resembled an entire town, home to hundreds of servants, courtiers, nobles, and royals. A lot of mouths to feed. And the task of preparing all that food took place in the palace kitchens. Remarkably, they're the largest surviving Tudor kitchens in Europe. Richard Fitch has been the historic kitchens manager here for 30 years.
I started working here Christmas 1992, for 1 year only, so I was told.
Henry VIII's kitchens at Hampton Court were legendary. Hundreds of cooks and servants slaved away producing incredible feasts for the king and his courtiers. By the reign of Elizabeth I, the court was getting through a staggering 8,000 sheep and almost 2,000 pigs every year. Meals could reach a whopping 5,000 calories a day, which might explain Henry's generous girth in later years. One of Richard's jobs is to create some of Henry VIII's favourite recipes, so he can explain to visitors what dishes would have tasted like back in the 1500s.
It's about taking those products and mixing them together in a way that the Tudors would understand and appreciate.
Do we need a fire today?
Today he's training up 2 new team members, Juliet Ibbison and Luna Wu,
Yeah, that's old sage.
in the art of Tudor cookery. Although they are keen historians, neither of them are confident cooks.
I'm definitely not a good cook. I famously set fire to spaghetti once, but I think that is part of the experience really and makes it all the more fun. Probably on that table.
The heart of the kitchens is the fire. In Henry VIII's time, the room got so hot that the staff started working naked. Henry had to come down in person to tell them to put some clothes on. And as fire was the only heat source for cooking, it was essential to keep it alight. 5 centuries ago, this would have been fed by 1.6 million logs a year. While these days it's not used quite as much, the palace still collects firewood in the traditional way. with its own team of rare breed Shire horses.
Ooh, big boy. There we go. There we go.
Today, Ed is working with 7-year-old stallion, William. William came to the palace as a shy rescue horse in 2020 and was trained from scratch. Ed needs to make sure he's confident enough to tackle a new challenge.
Today they're going to be pulling logs out of the woods. You know, when the trees die or get blown over, if they need them in the kitchens, we'll saw them up and take them up to the kitchens for them.
Shires are living history. They've been farming the palace grounds for centuries.
I mean, this is a continuation of what's been going on here since the days of Henry VIII.
Henry VIII's quest to breed the best war horse in the world led to the development of the massively powerful Shire horse. To this day, they hold the record for the most weight ever pulled by a horse. Even though William weighs just under a ton, there are huge benefits to using these gentle giants to move logs compared to modern machinery.
We can manoeuvre in and out easily, a lot easier with a horse than bringing a tractor in here because we don't do any surface damage because there's many habitats here and ecosystems going on here.
But the job is not without its risks.
Woodland work is the most dangerous work you'll ever do with horses because you don't just have to worry about a living horse that could bolt at any given time. Also, you've got a log dragging behind him. Steady. Whoa. So he's going to take down this fallen tree. He's never done this before. Job, son. That's whoa now. Whoa, I said. I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know how he's going to behave with it. Come back. Come back, man. Nice and steady.
William must stay perfectly still while Tom attaches his harness to the tree. It's crucial he doesn't bolt now.
Whoa, whoa, good boy. Come up.
After a moment of panic, William stays in control.
Steady, steady. Whoa. Come up. Steady. Whoa.
He takes a few steps and then comes to a halt.
Good boy. A class act. As you can see, he's done it fine. Perfect. Little bit jumpy because it's just the noise of the tree crashing around him, but he's very good on the whole.
Firewood sawn up.
OK, boys, up we go.
William can carry the logs back to the palace kitchens.
Yeah, just there. Good boy. Good boy.
Ready to feed the fire for a Tudor meal.
There's very little food evidence for Henry VIII's court, but what we do have are 4 surviving menus for meals that we know he did attend.
These menus are a highly valuable historic record and give a fascinating glimpse into what the Tudors considered delicacies fit for a king. Ordinary people would have had a basic diet of vegetables, grains and simple meats, but Henry VIII had a staggering 20 dishes on the menu for every meal, from tongue in gelatin to stewed sparrows.
Oh, we've got a recipe, 4 eggs in moonshine from 1545 to here. And it gives you instructions for what we're going to need to cook, how you're going to cook it.
The dish they're attempting would have been a second course. It's made by separating the yolk from the white.
So there's no shell, there's no white, it's just the yolk.
And boiling it in a very fragrant and at the time expensive ingredient, rosewater.
Eggs in moonshine is completely odd. About the closest would be Turkish Delight with that overpowering rosewater flavour to it, and that's a very subjective taste.
During Tudor times, strong, exotic flavours were the height of fashion for society's elite. Wildly expensive spices such as pepper and cloves were brought back from India and the Far East, and ginger was worth more than gold.
For the wealthy, for the courtiers, for Henry VIII, we're talking very highly spiced, simply to show off wealth.
Rosewater was first used in Persia as early as the year 700, and by the Middle Ages the recipe had made its way to England, which fell in love with this sweet, perfumed liquid.
All you've got to do is work out when it's cooked.
Well, it feels a lot harder now.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Done, do you think? OK, so you want to fish that out.
But the combination of scented rosewater and boiled egg yolk is something that's a little harder to stomach today.
No, I can taste the rosewater. It has like really strong.
Is that a good thing?
Why don't you try it yourself?
Okay.
I really burst in your mouth.
The thought of eggs poached in rosewater is really weird to most people, and that's key to understanding Tudor tastes.
It's a new day, and a big moment in the East Front Gardens for Sakira and the team. 7 months in the planning, Hampton Court's Remembrance Day installation is finally finished.
I think it's turned out really well, and it's really impactful, and it does what we want it to do, and it's quite emotional to actually to look at it all finished together like this. I think it's very poignant as well.
Indian soldiers played a huge part in the First World War. Many won military honours, including 25 Victoria Crosses. For Sakira, this memorial is very personal.
My great-great-granddad fought in World War I. To me, this is quite an important story to tell because we don't normally see Indian soldiers being part of this story. But Hampton Court, we've started that conversation, and hopefully it will bring a wider audience to actually understanding their contribution.
125 silhouettes of soldiers from both the British and Indian armies commemorate the sacrifices that were made by these brave men. Coming up, forgotten heroes leave their mark on Hampton Court.
Just make out a lot of graffiti that has been scratched into the pew.
And the palace honours the soldiers of the Great War.
You may have thought, will I see home again? Will I see my family again?
It's November at Hampton Court, and 125 silhouettes of Indian and British troops have been installed on the East Front lawn to mark Remembrance Day. For nursery team leader Martin Inchcombe, it's a chance to remember his grandfather who served in World War I.
He's in the middle here. If I can spot him, he's just there, that's right.
Martin's grandfather fought at the Battle of the Somme.
His name was Jim, and he served in the First World War, and he was 21 years old when he went over the top.
He survived the battle, but was captured and taken to a prisoner of war camp.
We were quite lucky, you know, that after what he did, he came back home. Very fortunate for us, and hey, without that, I wouldn't be standing here today. So, you know, I'm very lucky and proud of what he done.
And his grandfather's skills still live on in Martin today.
He loved his gardening as well. He had an allotment. I think at the prisoner of war camp they grew vegetables and things so they could feed themselves and survive. And he loved his rose trees particularly. Maybe that's rubbed off on me a little bit, you know, getting into gardening, you know, which is fantastic. Yeah, I feel privileged to have artefacts of my grandfather, his medals and the pictures. Emotionally, they make me feel sort of, he's still there, he's looking down. Yeah, I'm very, very proud of what he done.
Martin's grandfather spent the war far from home. For the soldiers who were billeted at the palace, there's one place in particular they might have found comfort: the Chapel Royal. It never fails to impress new curator Misha Ewan.
I actually haven't been in here since I started my job at Hampton Court, so it's really beautiful and amazing to be able to come in and have a look at it today and see all the detail on the ceiling. It's absolutely stunning.
The chapel has been in continuous use for the last 500 years, including throughout the two world wars when troops were stationed at the palace.
Hello, Misha.
Lovely to meet you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you.
And thank you for making
Chaplain Reverend Anthony Howe will be leading a Remembrance Day service.
Now we've got something rather interesting, so follow me into a pew.
He's meeting Misha to show her some very personal evidence of the soldiers who worshipped here over the years.
Now, it looks like every other pew in the chapel, really, but if you look very carefully and in a certain light, you can just make out a lot of graffiti.
Oh, yeah.
That has been scratched into the pew over the years. There's a full name there, and others are initials. And these were made by army officers, of all people. And so here is the result of them from the 19th century up until the First World War. We've got these names and initials.
So have you been able to identify some of the graffiti with officers' names that we know were based here?
Yes, possibly the most interesting one is this one here. Can you just see JDPF?
Yeah.
John French, who was at the time a lieutenant, so a junior officer, but then later, and this picture shows him as the colonel of the regiment.
John French eventually became a British Field Marshal during World War I and was for a time the Commander-in-Chief for the whole British Expeditionary Force. The Remembrance Day service is one of the most important events in the life of the Chapel Royal. It gives Father Anthony the chance to reflect on the role Hampton Court played during the two World Wars and the iconic figures from history who passed through these gates.
For a long time, Hampton Court was a military base, and so the chapel was the military chapel. Various officers were based here. One of them was a chap called Winston Churchill. The link between Hampton Court, especially in the last century, and remembrance of veterans, all of this is so important. I can think of very few places that have that strong tangibility that we do here. Let us remember God and commend to his sure keeping those who have died for their country in war, those whom we knew and whose memory we treasure, and all who have lived and died in the service of mankind.
I have memories of my grandfather as a child. I have memories of him being a really kind man, a gentle, quiet man, never talked about the war much or what went on. He very much sort of just got on with his life.
I think we can't overestimate the importance of remembering millions of people who died, and we must never forget that.
I just can't believe, you know, at that age doing something like that, and the fact that he went off and did, how courageous he was to do that. Yeah, I'm immensely proud of my grandfather going off to that war. He may have thought, will I see home again? Will I see my family again? You know, but he felt he needed to play his part as a soldier for his country.